Come for the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let's Meet Bread. Today on Let's Meet Bread, we are doing a bit of a truncated episode, but that's going to be okay because we're making a delicious focaccia. Now, this is not going to be your nonna's focaccia. This is going to be a little different, but at the same time, it should still be delicious and will make for a wonderful party treat. Or if you're going to bake it the way I'm going to bake it, it might even be good for some regular bread toasting and sandwiches. So let's get started. So what we're going to do first, we need to mix together some dry ingredients. Here I have 6 cups of all-purpose flour. The recipe calls for 5½ cups of all-purpose flour plus 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour. I don't really like the taste of whole wheat flour, so I'm not using it. But if you do want to go that route, you're welcome to do so. So we're just going to pour this in here. And to it, we are going to add our instant yeast. We have 1 tablespoon of instant yeast here. Let's just put that on top. This is all going to get mixed together, so it doesn't matter what order you put it in. Next up, we have kind of an interesting set of ingredients. So I have a herb medley here. So I have a teaspoon of garlic powder, 2 teaspoons of thyme, 1 teaspoon of basil, and 1 teaspoon of parsley. Now, I'm using parsley because I prefer the taste of parsley to oregano. If you don't like parsley, the recipe actually calls for oregano. All right, so we're just going to sprinkle this in here. Now, the recipe also calls for rosemary, but we don't put it in yet, so don't put it in yet. We're going to add it later. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to add just a little bit of fresh cracked pepper, about a tablespoon, and I'm just doing this here. It's going to be a nicer, fruitier taste. Just so you're aware, I am using dried herbs for everything I'm doing today, with the exception of the freshly ground salt and pepper. If you want a lovelier, fruitier flavor, you're going to want to do this with all fresh herbs. Okay. Now you want to make sure the fresh herbs have been washed and then lightly pat dry. Just put a little bit of salt in here. Now I'm using 2 different salts today. I'm using a regular grind table salt. I use Pink Himalayan sea salt for my grinder, but we're also going to use coarse salt on top a little later. Okay, so this is going to provide some extra flavor and some beautification to our focaccia once it is ready. But for now, we're not using it because we're just making the dough right now. Okay? All right. So next thing we need to do is create a well in our dry mixture here that we can put our wet ingredients in. So grab yourself a whisk or a spatula, or even just your hands, and just get in there and mix your dry ingredients together. And once you've done that, just make yourself a little well. I'm going to be doing pretty much everything by hand today, just because it feels a little bit more authentic to do it that way. But if you don't want to, you are more than welcome to use a different way of doing things, either with a whisk, or even you can pop this in the stand mixer and it will create a lovely well for you after about 30 seconds. All right, so I've got my well. I can't really show it to you or else I'll lose its lovely shape. But what's going to go in it first is 2 tablespoons, that's tablespoons of olive oil. We will use lots more olive oil later, but for now we're just putting a little bit in for that lovely olive flavor. And then we're putting in about a cup of water. All right, so I've got 2 3/4 cups of water here. Okay, but for now we're just going to put in a little bit of that, so about a cup of it. And this is at about 100 degrees. So let's see. Now, some of this water is a little discretionary, so what I mean by that is what's going to happen is we are going to only use so much of the water to create our light, our shaggy dough here. So fold this in at first. Get this all kind of mixed in, and then you can add water as needed to make a nice sticky dough. Okay. This is still going to have to be kneaded, so don't worry about it. If it feels like it's not getting as wet as it could, that's okay. We are going to add more water to it. We've just put in about a cup of water for now, just to get things playing together And if you're using fresh herbs, it should smell amazing. I'm using dried herbs and garlic powder, and it still smells really lovely. Just kind of playing with it right now. All right, so obviously you can see that I'm going to need a bit more water. I have some bits of the dough that are coming together, but most of it is still flour. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add the rest of that water. Okay, I'm just going to... All right, so we've added this in, and we are now going to... Oops. Minor technical difficulties, sorry about that, guys. All right, so we're going to add in the rest of our water slowly, right, because we don't want to put too much water in here. So I'm just going to add a little bit of water and then knead it in the bowl a little bit. Really what we want is for all the flour and dry ingredients to come together in one mass. And we want it to be a little wet, right, because we're going to knead it, and as we knead it, we're going to add more flour to it. A little bit escaped. So if you use all the water, that's just fine. Don't worry about it. And if it turns out you added a tiny bit of too much water, it's a little sticky, guess what? During the kneading process, we can fix all of that. So don't worry about it. All right, you can see now it's come together a little bit better. Oh, still got some escaping. But you can also see that I've clearly got some powder in here. So you know what that means? We are adding some more water. All right. And actually, I'm just going to add the rest of my water because I only had a little bit left. All right. So it's gonna seem like it's a little too liquidy at first, but that's okay. As I said, all of that is going to be cured when we turn this out onto our board and really start working it. And if you don't like the way it's shaping up in the bowl, you can always just add a little bit more flour. But I'm doing it all by hand today, so we're just gonna play with it until it looks right. All right, so this is clearly, if you look here, it's a little bit too liquidy. That's okay, because what we're gonna do is we're just gonna take the tiniest bit of extra flour and just dump that on there. Probably about 1/8 of a cup is what I just put in. And we're just going to get this to kind of solidify up just a little bit. Just so it comes together a bit more so it's kneadable. Because in its current state, can't really be kneaded. And as you can see, it's kind of getting everywhere. So we're getting closer. Oops, you're over here, you're over here. It's getting closer, but not yet. So we're just going to add that other 1/8 of a cup of flour in here. And just do the same thing. Get some kneading on in the bowl. And then once we're ready, we're going to lightly flour our work surface here. And we are going to knead until it passes the window pane test. Today's episode, by the way, is going to be a little different. One, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be a little shorter, but also because we are going to have 2 politics segments interspersed with our bread segment. Because this has to rise twice, but they're both really short rises, so I figured let's just do the whole thing on camera. Let's do everything on camera today. Make it special. All right. So we very much have one mass here, still very wet, but that's okay. So let's put this aside real quick. Just, there we go. Let's get some of that off. Don't worry about touching it. It does get baked. So no worries there. All right, so we're gonna put in a little bit of our lightly flour our work surface here. And just spread that out. And then we're just gonna turn our dough out onto here and we're gonna knead until it is nice and ready. Now it says 5 to 6 minutes, so if you really wanna set a timer, you definitely can, but I find the best way to knead is just to knead until it's ready. And as you know, if you are regular watchers of the show, that my method of telling when something is ready is the window pane test. So that's what we're going to do. All right. And again, this kind of looks like a heaping hunky mass. That's perfectly okay, because so just so you know, just something about bread doughs in general, it is easier to, correct them if they're too wet, right? Once it's too dry, it's really hard to get it to recover. But because you can almost always add flour to a recipe, it becomes much easier to rectify the putting in of too much water. All right. Now, if you have some left in your bowl like I do, don't worry about it. Do try and get it out, of course, because the more the merrier as far as bread is concerned, in my humble opinion. But it's really not that big a deal. So I'm going to try and get a little bit more of this out. But if it doesn't come out, that's okay. All right, so I've gotten pretty much all of it out. You can see there's a tiny bit left, but no big deal. All right, and you can see that I've used almost all of the flour on my board so far, so I'm just going to put a little bit more flour on this and a little bit more flour on my board, about a quarter or a third of a cup. Again, there's no pressure to use all of it, so if you put a little bit too much down, it's all right. All right, so once you can get a decent handle on it, and you can see that I have not gotten to that stage yet, you're going to start to try and knead it. You can see it's still sticking very much to my fingers, so it's not, it still needs some kneading. All right, so I'm going to flour my other hand here because I'm getting a bunch of flour in, so we're going to try and get some of this off. And again, this is just happening because I'm using my hands for everything. If you're using tools for this, obviously you're not going to have the problem with it sticking to you. But don't worry about it. My hands are clean, and besides the fact, it does get baked. So, all right, so we've got almost all that off. All right, put a little bit more of this on here. Perfect. All right, so you can see that our dough is in one mass. And we're just going to start the kneading process. Just take some more of this dough. Now, some of your dough may be flying off into little pieces. That's all right. We're just going to do what we always do. Use extra flour to help it stop from sticking. Now, the other great thing about doing everything by hand is that it's almost impossible to over-knead. So whether you've set that timer or whether you haven't, it's going to be really difficult if you're just doing this by hand with no machine at all to make this, to knead it too much. And you can see now that it really is starting to come together. And although I've got one hand that's still a little covered in dough, but in my other hand, you can see that it doesn't really stick at all, which is perfect. We are kind of getting where we want to go. So what that means is we're not likely to add any more flour unless it really needs it, which it might, right? As we knead, it will generate gluten, and it will start to desire more flour, right? It will get sticky again, and it will need more flour to make it not sticky. But for now, we've got a dough that really is not as sticky as it was. And you can see before, because it was essentially a soup, right? So we've really come a long way in a very short amount of time. And if you're keeping track, we added about half to 3/4 cup of flour on top of everything. So this recipe is a tiny bit bigger than it was, but no big deal. All right, you can see it kneads really nicely now. Hopefully yours is the same way. And it should be a nice soft dough, right? Because essentially this is just flour, water, and herbs, and a little bit of oil. And this is getting sticky again, so you can see that I'm pulling up some more of the flour that I need, and I'm probably going to be adding a little bit more flour to our work surface. And again, as you add flour, little bits at a time. I know I went a little bit more than I typically say, because I say to do about 1/8 of a cup at once, and I did closer to 1/4. But that's going to be a judgment call. So you can see this is getting sticky. All right, so we need some more flour. I'm just gonna put in a little bit here. And when you're working with flour, just spread it out, right? It's gonna be easier to work with. You can knead pretty much anywhere on your board and get flour right away. And just push and fold like we do for anything else. Now that's gonna be a little faster in a stand mixer, obviously. So feel free to use that to simplify it. Remember, if you're using an electric mixer or a standing mixer to do any of this work, just be careful you don't do it for too long so that you do not over knead your lovely focaccia. Over kneading, by the way, I know I really haven't explained this in past episodes, but over kneading can limit its ability to proof and can inhibit how it proves. So, and it also affects the final product, right, just generally. So we just want to make sure that it's nice. It does what we want it to, but also is not overdone. But if you're doing it by hand, that's pretty much never a worry for you. All right, so I've got a tacky dough in front of me. Let's roll it into a ball. And again, just use your cupping motion and just pass it back and forth between your hands. And we're just going to take a little bit of this dough, twist, using our thumb and finger to turn it out a bit like a pizza. And actually, it should smell a little bit like a pizza, so not so much an exaggeration at this point. And we're just going to spread it out as thin as we can without it breaking. And once it's at that nice and thin, oh, yeah. So you can see it broke. So it is not yet done. So we need to knead it a little bit more. But that's the best way to check. I know there are other ways to check, but really the best way to check to make sure that every single time you have a bread that is going to rise well and that is kneaded to perfection is going to be that window pane test. Board's getting away from me over here. And the other thing too, if you're looking to see if you're worried about the amount of flour we're adding, that's okay, perfectly fair. One of the ways that you can be sure that you're not adding too much flour is if your dough is still soft, right? If your dough kind of gets hard, it feels like it is losing some of its elasticity, it's losing some of its softness, it's not as easy to kind of squeeze, you might be putting a little bit too much flour in there. And I would say if you're at that point or if you're near that point, one of the things you can do is just make sure that you've kneaded it enough. And if not, keep kneading before you add more flour, right? At all times, your dough should maintain its nice suppleness, its softness, its light tackiness. All right. So we need this a little bit more. So we're going to try the test again. All right, so I'm going to take just a little bit, squeeze that off. All right. All right, slowly and surely give us a nice thin, and it already broke. So you can see it already broke. Let's try one more time because I think I may have put my thumb through it. We'll just try one more time. Just slowly, carefully, more carefully than I did before. Just all right, so if I slow down a little bit, you can start to see that I'm getting it a little wider. And we're almost there. All right, so yeah. So it still does break. So, right, that means we need more kneading, and it's also going to mean that we're going to need more flour. So we're going to put a little bit more flour on here. I'm starting to think that this recipe may have underdone it on the flour or overdone it on the water, but it's all right. We're just going to keep kneading away as you do. And we're just going to make sure that this is the perfect bit of focaccia. We're going to make such a beautiful bread today, guys. So I know this has taken a little bit of time, but it is going to be worth it. Really just get in there, make sure you're stretching those gluten strands. If you want to, right, do the two-handed method, turn, two-handed, turn, two-handed, turn, two-handed, turn, right? It's a perfectly good way to do it. It's slower, but you can actually see it stretching, right? So you really do get a sense of that you're starting to stretch it. And you'll have a better sense of when it's done too, because the stretching will get easier as you need it. Sorry, not the stretching will get easier, but the strands, like before it breaks, the amount it stretches before it breaks is going to be longer too. So you'll have a decent sense of when it's coming along. All right, but I'm going to go back to the one-handed because I prefer it. I know I say one-handed, I'm using a second hand to help me get it back up, but you can do this with one hand. Just push and turn. Get a little bit more flour in here. No ice cream man today. Usually I can't wait to get disturbed by the ice cream man. And obviously joking about that, it's happy to not have an extra sound on the stream. But you know, usually I've gotten interrupted by now. Where are you, ice cream man? Or woman, or person, ice cream person. And yes, in the chat, I see it is really fluffy. It's a lovely feeling. And when you make this dough yourself, you're gonna notice just how nice and soft and supple it is. And also, this whole room now smells like pizza. I mean, it's just a wonderful smell. If I had to make a bread every week, I would want one that smelled like this. Obviously, try and mix it up a little bit. All right, so we're going to try one more time. We've just been kneading it for another 2 or 3 minutes. And we're just going to see. All right. Oh, I've got a little bit more confidence in this one. Let's roll it into a ball real quick. And then we're just going to use our thumb and forefinger to slowly and carefully. Yeah, look at that. It's really stretching now. It's really stretching now. Oh, wow. Look at that stretch. Do you see that? Can you see that on camera? Yeah, let's move it a little closer. Look at that nice stretch. Yeah, I can see right through that. Perfect. All right, this is done. So I'm just gonna put this back into a ball. Oh, my board is moving all over the place. Gotta get something to secure it. All right, so we have our, in a ball, and an extra test, right? If you really like this method, push down, and it comes up about 2/3 the way. Doesn't come up all the way. All right, so now we need to let it rise. So we're gonna let it rise for about 30 minutes in this form until it doubles in size. It might not completely double in size, and that's okay. If you wanna let it rise a little longer, really not the end of the world. What we're just gonna do is we're just gonna do it for the 30 minutes and see where it's at. This rises a second time, remember, in our baking tray, and I'm going to show you what I've done for that because it really is different than what this recipe calls for. So I'm going to tell you what the recipe calls for, and then I'm going to tell you what I've chosen to do and why I've chosen to do it, okay? So let's prepare a bowl. We're going to get a nice big bowl. We're going to lightly pour some olive oil in there. Remember, this is a bread with olive oil in it, so we really want to preserve that beautiful olive flavor that we've gotten in here, along with our herbs, very much like a pizza, if we're making pizza dough, right? Very similar process. So, oops, turned into an oval on me. Here we go. More ball. All right, so get your bowl, lightly oil it. We're gonna cover it with plastic wrap, chuck a towel on it, and put it on for 30 minutes so it can rise. Then we'll talk a little bit of politics. After that, we will come back, we will press it into our pan, and then we will let it rise for another 15 minutes. Now, the pressing it into the pan might take a little bit of time because we're going to do it with our fingers. Everything from here gets done with our fingers, but we're not going to put the holes in it yet, okay? We wait till after the second rise to put the holes in it. All right, so for now, let's rise this bread. So I've got my bowl here. Just put a little bit. Now, less than a teaspoon, guys. Less than a teaspoon. You don't really want it to be over-oiled. Luckily, though, with this spread, if you do over-oil it, really not a big deal, because the beautiful thing about focaccia is that it uses lots of oil. If you're making it the traditional way, I'm going to use less oil, and I'm making it a non-traditional way. But that's all right. All right, so lightly oil your bowl, paintbrush, fingers, spoon, doesn't matter. Okay. We're going to take our little ball of bread and plop it in here, turn it around, get oil all over it. Just make sure it's done down perfectly with oil. Beautiful. All right, let me rinse my hands real quick because they're covered in oil. Then we'll put some plastic wrap on here, throw a towel on it, and set a timer. Alrighty. Again, if you have sustainable plastic wrap, feel free to use that. I use this because it's easier. If you have a lid, you can use that too. Just remember what I always say. If you have a lid, just be careful that you're not putting in like a vacuum seal, because if you do, you're going to notice about halfway through your rise that your bread is going to force the lid of your container right off. And whether it flies in the air like it's on some sort of cartoon, or it just kind of pops off, you can never know. So just make sure that you don't use a lid if it completely covers it and creates a vacuum seal. All right. So next thing, cover it with our tea towel. We're going to put it in on our oven here to rise. Now, I'm going to set a time for 30 minutes. So if you're not interested in the politics portion, I will see you in more or less 30 minutes. If you want to stick around for the politics, that's just fine too. I will be there. We will open the whiteboard in just a moment. All right, 30 minutes are on the clock. So let's take a look at the whiteboard. All right, and I don't see any questions in the chat, so we are going to get right on with our topic. So today, we don't have a ton of time, so I kind of want to grip onto a theme. I want to go back to kind of like a labor theme while we chat a little bit. So let's talk about atomization is a capitalist's best friend. So everyone knows the saying, right? A diamond is a woman's best friend. Well, I don't know how true that is, but what I will say is that atomization is a capitalist's best friend. That sounds a little confusing, right? So what's that mean? So atomization is the process by which people are separated from each other. Now, I don't necessarily mean this in the sense that it's been enforced on us in the pandemic, right, where we have to socially isolate and make sure that we are keeping our distance from individual for our own and their safety. And by the way, if you haven't gotten vaccinated, make sure that you're still following regular guidelines, masks, social distancing, number of people that can be in any given space, and things like that. Also, get your vaccine. It's totally free if you're in the US. You should get it. It will protect you from being hospitalized, even if you do get sick from COVID. So you should just get it. There are tons of doses available. There are lots of appointments available, regardless of where you are in the country. Okay. Sorry, back to atomization. So think about it this way. Oftentimes, even outside of the pandemic, you might feel that your connection to your coworkers isn't exactly all there. Sure, you might work on a team and you might have a supervisor and they may have a team, but think about how much work you're actually doing with them. Okay, so you argue, maybe you do a lot of work with your particular team, but maybe your team is atomized from the rest of the company. What I'm trying to say is the more that you work with either within very small groups or by yourself, the less likely you are to be discussing the way that you work with large portions of the company. You might get a sense of where I'm going with this. Once you are not concerned with the way that other people are working or the way that other teams are working, you're less likely to, feel empathy about what they are doing or how they're doing it. This, of course, these feelings of empathy and solidarity, as they were, are the key steps in forming a union. Now, of course, many capitalists will tell you that they don't need a union. Their shop doesn't need a union because management and the workers have an amicable relationship. But when you think about it, that's not always true. Whether it's, whether the individual managers have good relationships with their individual workers is one thing. But I'm not talking about individual managers, individual workers. I'm talking about, generally speaking, workers and generally speaking, management. So if you work in a place where there are lots of people who do the exact same thing as you and make the exact same wage as you or similar things like that, it might seem that you are not atomized, right? You have lots of people that you work with on the same level. You all kind of interact with management in the same way. There's some level of solidarity there. But even for people like grocery store workers, oftentimes you're in your own aisle or you're stocking things on your own. There's not a lot of kind of team stuff going on there. You have your set of duties and you do them more or less independently of anybody else. This stops you from having conversations about things like unionization. Amazon is another great example of this, where although people are doing the exact same thing and they're working actually in an atmosphere where conversation should be natural. They're all in a large warehouse, they're spending lots of time working, doing the exact same thing. They all interact with management in the same way, which is to say badly. But because of the way that Amazon organized its warehouses, individuals being required to use the bathroom for very limited amounts of time, then being tracked by devices that, even if you slow down a tiny bit, forbid you from spending time and doing other things, right? Because you can be punished for any of these slowdowns. So even in areas where atomization doesn't seem like it would be natural, it still occurs. And the reason for this is to prevent you from forming a union. Or even if you don't love unions, think about it this way. If you can't spend the time to talk to other people or you're not in the same space as them, you don't really feel connected to them. So if they're suddenly fired or replaced, sure, you might miss them as a person a little bit, but the likelihood that you were very well connected to them or that you knew them well or understood who they were as a worker is pretty low because of the way that these systems are organized. Now, I know I've talked about kind of blue-collar shops, but what about in the white-collar world? Well, in the white-collar world, there's a little bit of a different set of scenarios, but it's the same basic thing. Oftentimes, you're working, and this is very true in the information economy, where you are spending lots of time working individually or in small teams on small projects. You're not spending a lot of time interacting or interfacing with other people in the business. And although in normal times you could still go to the office and have conversations with people, there's oftentimes a pressure for you to not take many breaks, or for you taking long breaks and getting to know your coworkers and things, to just, hey, if you're done early, just go home, right? That also is a form of atomization, that encouragement, because it stops you from understanding from an empathy point of view your fellow workers. All this leads to the same goal. Don't form a union. That's what the capitalists want anyway. But even further than that, let's think about it from a pandemic perspective. We are all working from home, except for those who are not able to. So I know I've just addressed the people who are not working from home, Let me address the people who are working from home for a second. So think about it. You're working from home. You don't get to see people. You don't interface with people in person on a regular basis. You don't, unless you're regularly scheduling these little Zoom or Teams or Skype or whatever calls with people for social purposes. Most of us are just working our hours and going home. And by the way, this is perfect for a capitalist who does not want you to form a union. There is almost no way in these little societies for you to discuss things that are not related to work. And meetings, more and more, are categorized as unnecessary or unproductive. And if you have a meeting, have an agenda, make it short. There's no time for you to essentially learn more about your fellow workers and what they're going through and other things like that, right? The reaction, instead of what can we talk about that will help us build solidarity, is, oh, well, I don't want to keep you. You should go and figure out whatever it is that you need to take care of, or, oh, I'll let you go take care of your family situation, as opposed to saying, oh, I didn't realize that you were going through this. Is there any way I can help? We're taught that the best way to go through this, any struggle that we're having, is just to let the individual handle it on their own. This is another form of atomization. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about concerning white-collar work, specifically related to the pandemic, is what about return to office stuff, right? So oftentimes you're not making the decision about whether you go back or not, or if you are making the decision, it's a throttled process. There's only so many people back allowed in the office at a time. There's only so many people, allowed to go back to certain offices or certain locations, or only so many people are allowed to work so many days from work at a time. And what this does essentially is it stops the same group of people from being in the same room all the time, which leads to you not really having the opportunity to get that break room talk, to chat about things that are more personal than just your work. So whether it's intentional or not, these practices continue to isolate workers from each other and from the spaces where they could communally organize, whether that's break rooms or Zoom calls or team meetings. Now, of course, there's another category of workers who are completely and totally atomized, to the point where forming a union seems almost impossible. And actually, on this side, there's a little bit of good news. So I'm sure you've heard of the gig economy at this point. It's huge. Tons of people participate in it, for better or for worse. And although the practices behind the gig economy aren't always great, there do seem to be lots of people who are interested in just picking up an app and working when they want, which sounds great. And for some people, it might be great. Personally, I think the gig economy is mostly a scam to atomize workers and maximize profits for the capitalists who own them and the capitalists who are essentially funding these projects. Uber is a great example. But say you're a worker and you enjoy the gig work that you do. Okay, fine. I don't want to take that away from you necessarily. But if you do that work, you should be fairly compensated. You should have perks. You should have benefits. There should be other things that come to that job. And by the way, not only fairly compensated, but the compensation you make should be enough to live on and then some. The purpose of working is not to survive, it's to thrive. So if you were unsatisfied with your work as a gig worker, who would you talk to? Do you know other people who are gig workers with you? Do they work in the same town or same location as you? How would you organize a strike? Could you organize a union? Be impossible, right? Partially because you just don't know who is a fellow gig worker and what their scenarios are like. Oftentimes, gig workers are working more than one working more than one gig in order to get by. So someone who drives for Uber may also drive for Lyft. Someone who works at Caviar may also be an Uber driver in their spare time. This lack of knowledge and lack of clarity is an additional atomization tool of the capitalist class, which effectively stops you from having any good way of organizing. But I did say there was good news here. So what was I talking about? So recently, there has been some movement among Uber and Lyft drivers to organize online in other spaces, social media and the like. And they have actually called a strike among multiple cities. I don't remember all the details of it, so please feel free to look it up. But again, for all those who are not striking, don't cross the picket line, find another way to get around. Public transport is great. But for those who are striking, solidarity to you. You have overcome an incredible obstacle, atomization of the workplace. You literally don't work with anyone else. You literally don't work with teams. Your interaction with management is incredibly personalized, but at the same time, it's impersonal. Only you are going to management, but management just sees you as a number. So you are fighting against the greatest odds, but they've been able to organize a strike. one that may actually have real consequences for the people who manage Uber and Lyft, which would be incredible. It would show that regardless of your industry, it is possible for you to really get to a point where you can overcome the levels of atomization, that the barriers to union creation and solidarity creation that have been put in front of you. So at the end of the day, I guess the point of this segment is, when you're working, regardless of what your job is, whether you work in a grocery store or a factory or an IT job or whether you're working a gig or whatever, think about your fellow workers. Think about what ways you can help them that don't involve them taking care of things on their own. Offer your support where you can. Offer to do things for them where you can. These small acts of what most people would just call kindness are really part of building solidarity. And the more solidarity you build, the more solidarity you will feel in return, because you will start to create a culture where workers care about each other. And the greatest of these cultures is the labor union. Whether you organize officially or unofficially or what have you, as long as you're finding a way to make it so that your organization, whatever it looks like, is able to fight back against management in a way that is beneficial for you and your fellow workers, that's all that matters. You can call it whatever you want. The principle is the same. You, the worker who creates the value for the company, regardless of what company it is, should be the ones that makes the decisions on important things like your pay, your benefits, your severance, if that is applicable, your hours, things like that. There's a large strike going on at the Frito-Lay factory, right? They've been striking for a week and change now. There's a huge coal miners strike going on. It's in its 4th month now. You probably haven't heard a ton about these because they're not really going to get televised that much. But the message that you should get from this segment and from all the alternative media who are covering strikes and labor actions and labor organization all around the country and indeed around the world is that the barriers that the capitalist class puts in front of us to stop us from feeling empathy and solidarity with our fellow workers are just that, barriers. And any barrier can be surmounted, especially when we take the time to get to know the people who we work with and to understand from a serious perspective, empathy. Not just the empathy of, I want to help you, I'll let you go do your thing on your own, but the empathy of cooperation, of collaboration, the empathy of, hey, it looks like you're struggling. What can I do to help you? What can we do to help you? Build communities, and those communities in the workspace build unions. And these will allow you to tell management that you're not going to go back to an office when you feel unsafe. You're not going to be required to do this thing or that thing. You are not going to work for a starvation wage. You are not going to work on your weekend. We workers have the power to force the capitalist class to give us our due, to make it so that we have an enjoyable workspace. And even if we don't enjoy our work, that we have enough time away from work that we can recover before we go do something else. Or we have the freedom to get another job or to stop working. All of these fights require workers, the people who create value for society, not just for individual companies, but for society as a whole, to think more about their struggles as group struggles. The people who run society, the capitalist class, they want us to think about our struggles as being our own. They want us to think about poverty as being personal failures. They want to atomize us socially, politically, and in our workspaces as much as possible. Because every opportunity that we take to create solidarity in whatever situation that we happen to be in is one more opportunity where we can push back on the idea that everything is individualized, our successes and our failures. Because the truth is, we have to work together to gain the things that we want. Because if not, management will just get rid of you. Because depending on what your industry you're in, you might just be a number. You might be incredibly replaceable. And because there's always people looking for jobs, you don't know how safe you are. unless you take the time to form a union, whether it's a labor union or some other type of community. We can fight atomization and we can win. We just have to work at it. Excuse me. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about in our short little politics segment here is the immorality of cutting unemployment benefits now. So I'm a little late to this story, admittedly. However, it's still important to think about what's going on. So you may have heard that many states are concerned about what has been dubbed a labor shortage, right? Many organizations and companies are starting to open back up, but many of their furloughed workers don't want to come in, partially because the pay that's being offered is paltry. And that's especially true now when workers are expected to put their personal health and well-being on the line for these companies' profits. This is especially true, as I'm sure you've seen, in the restaurant industry and other industries where people work directly with other human beings, specifically in situations where, you know, it might be harder to socially distance or to maintain some, to some type of distance from other people. So mass transit, for example, and things like that, right? So some states in the United States have reacted to this by saying, well, if you're not going to come back to work voluntarily, then we're going to force you back to work. Well, how are they going to force you back to work? You can't just do that, right? Well, you kind of can. And what states have been doing, some states anyway, has been saying, well, clearly the reason that people can afford to stay at home and not work or look for better jobs is because the government is paying them an unemployment insurance. Now, by the way, unemployment insurance already has some unfairness built into it, which is that if you get a job offer, so first of all, you have to be looking for a job the whole time in order for you to maintain your unemployment insurance. And at some level, you have to prove that you are searching actively for a job, which feels incredibly unfair. Some people just need the time to relax and recuperate, but they're not getting that. Additionally, once you do get a job offer after you're supposed to be looking for weeks and weeks and weeks, you have to take it. I repeat, you have to take it. You don't get a choice. Because if you don't take it and they report and the company reports to the government that they offered you a job and you didn't take it, guess what? You lose those benefits and you can't get them back. So that's the unfairness that started with this program, which, by the way, is nuts in all sorts of ways. But, you know, another rant for another time. But now there's an additional unfairness being put on because people in some states are realizing that the primary factor which is stopping people from going back to work is the fact that they can afford not to work right now because of these benefits. So these states are saying, well, if they're starving, they'll go work. So they are cutting these benefits prematurely, which is completely immoral. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about why it's so immoral that these benefits are being cut now. And it is especially true in the particular states, what in the US are called red states, ones that are run by Republicans primarily, and how this is, essentially a crime. So say you are looking for a job, maybe you want to, maybe you don't want to, whatever, right? You're looking for a job because you have to, you're on unemployment, and you're getting a certain amount of money from your state, based on whatever formula they use, and then you're getting an additional amount from the government. Perhaps for the first time, you don't feel like you're poor all the time. You actually have enough money to maybe even put a couple $100s away. This is the reality for thousands and thousands of Americans who are feeling now for the first time that even though they used to work all the time, they weren't making enough to live. And now that they're not working, they're finally getting enough money that they can actually start to live a little bit. Not just survive, but thrive, put some money away, think about the future. But, you know, and by the way, this is happening now because the companies that they were working at, these people were working at, weren't paying them well enough for this, right? So many Americans are feeling a boon right now, which I would argue is great and that they should just go on forever. But these are being cut, as I mentioned before. And this is so incredibly immoral because the pandemic isn't over. Like, many people are acting like the pandemic's over and that some places can start to open up, but it's not. Not only do we have the Delta variant, which most people have heard about, we also have the Gamma variant and countless other variants. This virus, as in, you know, COVID-19 and its various variants, are, you know, they continue to infect people. They continue to kill people. Now, mind you, mostly it's unvaccinated people, but we don't know how long that's going to last either. We have failed as a society, as a globe, to vaccinate enough people to get rid of COVID-19. So essentially, it's going to keep doing what I predicted it was going to do on this show a couple weeks ago, which was keep infecting people and keep getting to a point where it could possibly mutate into something else. And the more mutations it has, the higher chance it is that we are going to end up in a situation where one mutation or variant or what have you beats the vaccines, is better than the vaccines, right? And we'll start to kill people again in large numbers. We'll go back to lockdown. We'll go back to all these other things. So while all this is happening, states are saying, hey, you workers that we said were essential, yeah, you're not so essential. You still are essential, but we don't want to pay you like you're essential. And more than that, we want you to get your ass back to work. So these people are going to have to, unfortunately, go back to risking their lives day in and day out for jobs that they definitely don't want to be in, because someone else at another level decided, well, you know, it's time, right? And what are they basing that off of? Well, you know, the economy is shrinking and then some stuff's starting to open up, so we need workers. And we need them to work for slave wages in this country again. And workers are refusing to go back. So the logical solution seems to be to starve them out. Which, I mean, I know I'm using harsh terms, but because what's going on is harsh. Truthfully, they're saying, we are just going to make it so that you run out of money, and once you run out of money, you'll have to come to us again to get money, and the only way for you to do that is to work these types of jobs, where you end up in situations where your life is on the line. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So you're going to be working in a way that puts your life on the line for someone else, and they're not paying you extra for that, right? We're not talking about companies offering hazard pay, offering even living wages, but there is a concerted effort by politicians to say, regardless of how safe you feel, regardless of whether you're vaccinated or not, regardless of whether you're enjoying the time that you don't have to work, we don't care because we have to make money, okay? We have to grow because capitalism demands growth from everything, right? You gotta just grow and take it, strip and resource, right? Strip these resources from people. We have to make profits and profits and profits and profits and profits. And we can't do that without workers that we can pay nothing or close to nothing. And by the way, like I said earlier, all this is going on while there's a pandemic. All this is going on while you're asking those same workers who you're still not going to pay well, do this for, you know, the same paltry wage we wanted to pay you before or less, right? There are reports of people who are losing their seniority that they had back when they were working, that they're being treated like they're new employees, that their wages are actually going down. But they cannot withhold their labor for the system and fight for better rights because essentially they're going to run out of money. And they're going to have to go back to some situation where they're selling their labor for money because we still need to eat. We still need to pay rent. And although evictions in many places are still not allowed, there have been reports of landlords who are getting around the eviction bans, who are pre-filing evictions and just waiting for the courts to open up again so that they can evict people as soon as possible. The system is working against these people, these workers, who, by the way, and I shall remind you again, are generating all of the wealth for the system, right? So there's a squeeze on what were up until recently called essential workers, who are supposed to be praised and paid well and rewarded, but they're not being rewarded. They're being seen as chattel in this system that needs to generate as much profit for a small group of people as possible. Now, this may not apply to every small business, every small restaurant, but the truth is these small business owners also need to make money, right? So because they had to close down their business, they also had to put themselves in a situation where their ass is on the line because they don't have savings either, okay? The small business class, the petite bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, so the petite bourgeoisie, they don't have, in our system now, they don't have a ton of savings either. They're not living high on the hog. Oftentimes, they're also just making things neat too. So even if it's not malicious on their part, they need to find a way to keep the lights on, and they do that by hiring back workers, by going back into service, by reopening up, even if it's not safe, because the system demands more money over and over again, right? It demands money be extracted from us and given to the capitalist class. And this upward transfer of wealth just continues and continues. And, forcing people back into that, giving people no choice, is just completely immoral. Capitalism was supposed to allow us to sell our labor in a way that was supposed to be beneficial to us, that would allow us to earn well. The saying always goes, right? If you work hard and do what you're supposed to, you'll live well and you'll retire well. But that hasn't been true for decades. We're living in a fantasy that doesn't work. The system has taken its time, but it has done what it was always intended to do, just like every system before it. Funnel money to those who are already rich and already powerful. Take it from the rest of us and force us to keep coming back to a table we don't want to eat or work at. So for those of you who are suffering because your benefits are being cut and you're being forced back to work jobs you don't want to work, solidarity with you. I wish it wasn't this way. And to the legislators out there who think it's a good idea to starve people out of their homes to work jobs that could kill them, fuck you. Fuck each and every one of you. I hope that you burn in whatever version of the bad place, bad afterlife that you believe in, because you are literally creating policies that will get people killed, possibly thousands of people. And you're doing it so that the people who fund your campaigns can make an extra buck. And that's sick. It's gross. Okay? It's completely immoral. We should not be in a situation where this should even be possible. They should have a universal basic income. We should have structures in place so that if people don't want to work, they don't have to. If the economy needs to shut down for a little bit of time, it can. We have ways to make this happen. Stop pretending like we don't. We could have gotten rid of this pandemic, but people had to make money. So that's the direction we went in. It's gross. All right, so it has been 30 minutes. So that means we are ready to check our bread. Let's take a look. Holy Toledo. All right, this has more than doubled in size. That's perfect. I'm gonna be honest with you, I didn't actually expect it to rise this much, but I was wrong, so what are you gonna do? All right, so let's put this aside here because we are gonna reuse this. Waste not, want not, guys. All right, so look at this lovely bread. All right, we're gonna put this here. So now we are going to start to shape our bread, okay? So the way that we're going to do that, so this recipe calls for you to place your bread in a pan like this. This is this pan specifically is 18 by 11. The recipe calls for 17 by 11. The recipe calls for 18 by 11 or a half sheet tray. 17 by 11 will do just fine. But as you might imagine, if you use a tray like this, you're going to get a bread that's only about yay tall, right? Sorry, about yay tall. So I actually wanted a bread that was a little thicker because I want to use it for sandwiches and toast and things. So instead of using a flat tray like this, which is what you're supposed to use, and if you want, you should use, instead I lined myself a baking pan. This is a 9 by 13 by 2 baking pan, and we are going to make our focaccia in here. And this is so that the focaccia puffs up really nicely and essentially is great for sandwiches and toast and things. All right, so we are going to, before we pour our bread out, so I have lined my baking pan with oil, and I've stuck parchment to that oil. If you are using a regular sheet tray, you're going to want to use a ton of olive oil just to lubricate this up a little bit. I'm only using a little bit, and I'll add more as I need. But what you're going to want to do is just take your hands and create a nice thin layer for your focaccia. This is going to be lubricating it so that it doesn't stick once it bakes. By the way, it bakes at a very high temperature, 485 degrees. So if you want to wait a little bit, you can. But if you have an oven that's very slow, like I do, you want to set your oven to 485 degrees, more or less right now. Okay, so I'm just doing this. I'm taking a couple seconds with it, but if you are already done, or if you want to set your oven first, obviously I can bake this off camera, then you should set your oven to 485 degrees Fahrenheit. One more thing you should note, if you're doing it the way that I'm doing it, I've just put a second teaspoon of oil in here. If you're doing it the way I'm doing it in a tall tray like this, be aware your cook time is going to be slightly higher than the cook time, if you are not doing it this way. Same basic result though, it's going to look lovely and golden brown, and it's going to register at 205 degrees when checked multiple times in multiple different places. All right, so we're all lubricated up. You can see there's a nice sheen of the oil in there. I'm just trying to catch the light just right. There we go, perfect. All right. So luckily, I've got some oiled fingers, so we're going to move our dough right in here, perfect. And using hands covered in oil, so using hands that are oily, you're just gonna spread out your dough with your fingers. Just spread it out into the dish here. Now, this is going to be a little easier for me because I'm using a smaller, I'll show you what I'm doing. I'm using a smaller dish here, but if you're using the long flat dish like you're supposed to, and you're being a good Italian noodle, wow, that was really insensitive, I'm sorry. A good Italian noodle. A good noodle where you're doing this the traditional Italian way. God, that was really bad, I'm sorry guys. We're just gonna use your hands and spread this out. Now, if it doesn't spread out for whatever reason, you're having an issue spreading it out, that's okay. It just means your bread needs to sit for another 5 minutes or so. So just, again, you don't have to put it back in the bowl, just let it sit here for another 5 minutes, and once it's done, try to spread it out again. And if it doesn't work then, another 5 minutes, and so on and so forth, until you have this beautiful spread out focaccia here. You can see that mine is very much spread out all the way. So, perfect, just get those finishing touches on that. And don't put the finger holes in it yet, okay? We're not doing that yet. We're gonna let it sit for another 15 minutes, and then we're gonna push down on it. All right, so we are going to cover this once again. See, I told you we're gonna use this plastic wrap another time. We're gonna cover this with plastic. another time. To the extent possible, if you have to fold over your parchment to make that work, do so. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna fold over my parchment here. Just to make this easier for us. Guys, this is gonna be great. I cannot wait to show you what this looks like and to cut into it. It's gonna be so wonderful. All right, so we are covering this, and we're gonna set a timer for 15 minutes now. And we're gonna throw our tea towel over it again. Kind of wider, here, I'll just put it over here. All right, so we've set our timer for 15 minutes. We are now going to go back to politics one more time for one more segment, and then this will be ready to go. Oh, quick thing, set your ovens, 485 degrees, everybody. Set your ovens right now. All right, it is about to get real toasty in here, but that is A-okay. Actually, I can leave it there. All right, so back to the whiteboard. And unfortunately, I don't really have a great topic for y'all. I mean, I do, but it's depressing. All right, we are back. Again, nothing new on the chat, so let's go forward with it. So, from California to Germany to Syria to China, climate change is here. So, what do we do now? So, what I'm talking about, I'm sure you've seen, there are wildfires in California. The droughts in Syria are believed to would have led to the civil war there. Germany and Belgium just had this incredible, and I mean that in the worst way possible, flooding that killed dozens of people and, you know, forced out, I'm forgetting the word for it, forcibly relocated, I don't know if that's the right, anyway, unhoused, I guess. Anyway, these floods in Germany, you know, caused untold amounts of damage and, you know, created landslides and destroyed homes and businesses. And in China, although it's getting a little bit less news coverage, unfortunately, there were these wild floods where 4 months worth of rain fell in a single day. And people were stuck in traffic. There were people who drowned in their cars. There are people who are riding the metro in this particular Chinese city and got stranded down there until rescue workers could save them. I mean, the pictures coming out of China and Germany are just really, really horrifying. You know, and so, you know, the moral of that story, I mean, I could go on with examples forever, and I don't want to, because I mean, I don't want this to be so depressing, I guess. And but climate change is here, right? So the moral of this story is that climate change is here. We are, you know, we spent time talking about prevention, but you can't prevent something that's already arrived. So at this point, we need to think about this from not a prevention point of view, but from a, you know, an adaptation point of view. How is humanity going to adapt to the situation that we've created via climate change? And, you know, this is going to require us to fundamentally change the way that we do things. So one, you know, the middle of the earth, not like the center, but like the equator and areas around there, are going to get unbelievably hot, and people are just not going to be able to live there. The land that's now called fertile in the Mediterranean, things will be desert before long. The heat will just keep killing off, you know, will just keep killing off things until people can't live there anymore. And then what's going to happen, right? People are going to want to move. They're going to want to escape somewhere. They're going to go north or south where it's cooler. And we're going to have our politics are going to have to fundamentally change, right? Because we're going to have essentially all these people who need to live somewhere come to places that aren't really prepared for them. We're about to have an immigration crisis, the likes of which we've never seen. And by the way, for better or for worse, immigration does typically tend to create some level of frustration by the people who are already living there. Now, I honestly think that we are in a post-scarcity society, and that we can take these people on if we have to, and there is work for them to do and stuff like that if it needs to be thought of in that way. But the truth is there are some portions of society that are going to be nativist and are not going to want these new refugees, these climate refugees, but we're about to have lots of them, right? We need to adapt to that. Crop yields are going to be down. The amount of water available for humans to drink and wash their hands with and shower with and all that is going to decrease. I mean, we're seeing it out on the West Coast right now with the Hoover Dam, which is operating at like 30% capacity or something like that. I mean, we need to adapt to that, right? So either we need desalination technologies, or we need, to change the way that we use water, or use different types of water for consumption versus irrigation and things like that. Fun fact, most of the water usage out in California, where they're experiencing lots of drought right now, is agriculture. They're using fresh water for that. I hate to break it to you, but like, your food is not going to taste any different if wastewater or used water or even dirty water is used for watering these plants, right? As long as that dirty water, it doesn't contain, harmful chemicals in it, then in theory, the plants can actually filter all of that out. It just changes the soil a little bit, but plants actually have complex filtration systems. Soil is a complex filtration system that plants can use, right? So we need to adapt the way that we use water. We're gonna have to change where we live, just in general, not even talking about like whole countries, but the United States, for example, is a large country with most of its wealth on the coast, and waterfront property is gonna cease to be a thing. I mean, as waters can transform our landscape so quickly, we're gonna have to adapt, and people are gonna have to be rehoused further inland because sea level is going to continue to rise. Governments have to plan for that, right? Most people, when they move house, are going to do so because they can only afford to, because they sell their house to someone else. Well, what if nobody's buying, right? You can't sell to no one, right? And still expect to have enough money to move to a new place. This is going to be a job for governments to handle. There's going to have to be some understanding of where is allowable to live and what types of food that it makes sense for us to continue to grow given the changing of the climate, right? Animal species are going extinct at an alarming rate. How that affects biodiversity, we need to adapt. So I guess the point of this segment, and I keep going on about all these things, but they are really important, is, we thought a lot about how it is that we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And in some ways, we are still thinking about that. But the truth is, that's no longer going to cut it, because the effects of rising global temperature are already here. So while it is still a noble goal to try and reduce the amount that we change the climate, or even change it back to the extent that we are able to do that, we need to kind of, and this is going to sound super hippie of me, but we need to get back in sync with nature, because if we don't, our entire strategy is going to have to be adaptation. And humans, like biologically, we just don't handle these types of things particularly well. Like humans, because of the way that we evolved, are good at responding to sudden catastrophic events as they happen, right? But we're not good, we don't panic about slow moving disasters like climate change. And because climate change is already here, we're now going to have to react to these events as they happen, which isn't great, because essentially what's going to happen is we're going to get to a place where we're just reacting and reacting and reacting and reacting and trying to create situations where we are safe from what's already happened, instead of trying to create situations where, we are not subjected to these types of things that are going to continue to happen, right? So if a city floods, we're going to try and move people out instead of moving people out before the city floods, right? Wildfires are another thing, right? So once a town burns down, like Paradise, California did in 2019, we're going to want, or 2020, 2019, 2020, 2020. Once Paradise, California burnt down, and Linden, I think it's called, in Canada, burnt down, the government responses were, oh, well, we have to rehouse people. We have to find other places for people to live. But it was too late, right? We didn't take the steps to prevent the fires. We just took the steps afterwards. And as we move to a situation where these types of catastrophes are going to happen more and more and more and more, if we continue to act in the way that we've always behaved, which is to simply react to something once it happened, we are going to experience untold amounts of death and hostility and, unspeakable horrors. There's really no good way to describe what is going to happen to us as a species if we continue to just be reactionary. And biologically, we're pinned up to do this, right? If you think about the way that humans have evolved, that we evolved from apes and things, it's about reaction, right? There's no preventatives being taken care of in the biological world. But we have the ability to change that. We have the ability to try and prevent. Now, we were not able to prevent climate change, and I personally think there's a lot of capitalism that's to blame for that. But even if you don't agree with that, the point is climate change is here, and we have to start thinking differently about how we manage humans' existence on Earth. Because if we only say we can do something after the disaster has happened, we're going to end up in a situation where huge amounts of people are going to get killed off. And it will have been preventable, right? It will have been wholly preventable if we had just taken the time and the resources to prevent it. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has this great line about this in relation to the Green New Deal that I think is just so poignant. And she says, something along, I don't remember the exact quote, but she says something along the lines of, you guys talk about, how can we afford the Green New Deal? But as the cost of fighting the climate increases, the real question becomes, how can we afford not to have a Green New Deal? How can we afford the consequences of not having a Green New Deal? And I just think that analysis is so spot on. The costs of cleaning up the disasters that will occur from climate change is not going down. It's only going to continue to rise. So if we don't take the time now to spend time and money to prevent it, then it will cost us more in the long run. What's the old saying? A penny of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it's so true, and especially true for climate change. We have to change the way that we behave. We have to change the way we do things so that when these disasters start to become more regular, and they will, and they are, we have taken the time to prevent the deaths that could happen. I mean, if I can get real with you guys for a second, I don't want to die of climate change, and I'm sure you don't either. And what do we do if the powers that be, are either too old or too powerful or too rich for it to affect them? And you get to a point where you just are so worried about what's going to happen. And, luckily where I am hasn't necessarily been affected by one of these catastrophes, but, my bills are going up, the heat, the air conditioning bill is going up, the heat in the place where I live is, it's hotter than it's ever been. I mean, it's happening, and we have to do something. Or else the type of disasters that we experience will just yeah, it's just gonna be too much. It's gonna be totally unbearable. And yeah, this is really depressing, and I didn't really want this to get so depressing. I mean, I knew it was going to be depressing, but yeah, I wish I had a better outlook for you guys for this, but the truth is I don't. We're kind of set up to fail this, and I'm just really nervous that we're going to. Yeah. All right, we are back for the second time, and we are going to go check our bread. We're going to, oh, that's our timer. Thank you, timer. All right, let's bring our bread over. Let's take a look. All right, so it's puffed up quite a bit. So now what we're going to do is take our plastic off. All right, we are done with this, so you can toss this if you want. All right, so now what we're going to do is we are going to put on our herbs. We have some rosemary here. We're going to do 2 teaspoons of rosemary, and I'm using dried, but you should use fresh if you can. Oops. There we go. And we're just going to lightly sprinkle some rosemary on here. It's beautiful. Hopefully yours looks nice as well. All right, so I've got some rosemary on here. It's going to be lovely. And then I have a 1/4 cup of shredded mozzarella, and I'm just going to sprinkle that on here on top of our rosemary. If you want to use more mozzarella, you definitely can, but you don't have to. And then once we do that, we're going to take some oil. And we're going to create all the fun little holes that focaccia is well known for. Just a little bit in the edges here. Obviously, we don't want to have anywhere without any mozzarella in it. So a bit over here, a little bit over there. And just, there you go. All right. So now what we are going to do, just at the very end here, oh, I'm sorry. 425 degrees. I'm sorry, not 485. 425. I am so sorry about that, guys. I got it a little wrong. My apologies. 425 degrees. She said 425 degrees. Okay. Goodness gracious. All right. All right. So we're going to take our fingers, and we're just going to, so I'm putting 8 fingers now. We're just going to push down and create little dimples in our dough. And just push some of the herbs in and create some of that nice, there we go. And by the way, this is going to help even it out as well. So put as many dimples as you want. Oh, and before we put our oil on, let us put on some coarse salt. This will just give us some extra lovely salty goodness to go on our focaccia. Let's close that off there. And then we're just going to pour a healthy amount of olive oil. Just little slow drizzle. Just want to put Yeah, just put some olive oil on the top here. Now, if you want to go back through your dimples and push it in, or if you want to just turn the tray a little bit and let the oil go where the oil wants to go, you can do that. I'm just gonna spread out, and I'm gonna redo my dimples now that I've got my oil in here. Spread out my oil. This will also allow you to spread out some of the other stuff we've just put on. So there we go. All right, look at that. Doesn't that look wonderful? It's beautiful. All right, so our oven is set, and so this is going to cook for 25 to 30 minutes if you're doing it on a regular tray. Now I'm doing in here, so what I'm probably going to have to do is I'm going to probably have it in for 25 to 45 minutes, and I'm probably going to just cover it with some foil about 30 minutes in, okay? So if you're doing it like this, like I am, nice and thick, it will rise. Remember, you know, it needs to sound hollow when you knock on it with your knuckles, and you need to make sure that no matter what you do, it is at least 205 degrees so it's fully cooked. But, you know, if you don't want to get it too brown, you don't like the color on it at any point. By the way, this is with any bread too. If the color is getting too dark for you, just put a sheet of foil on it if it needs to keep cooking, and it will keep cooking and the color will pretty much stay the same. All right, guys, I am going to get a napkin and then put this in the oven. Thank you so much for watching. I've really enjoyed making this, and I'll have a picture for it. I'll have a picture for you guys. And I will see you all next time. Take care.